It was a quiet evening on the open plains of the American West, far from the bustling towns and busy life of the cities. The land stretched endlessly, filled with tall grasses swaying in the breeze, and the mountains in the distance stood as silent watchers over the world below. James Mercer, a man who had chosen the solitude of a ranching life, lived on a small piece of land at the edge of this wilderness. His ranch was a long ride from the nearest town, a place where he could live by his own rules, free from the noise and distractions of the world. Yet, despite the peace, there was a certain loneliness about the place that never quite left him. James was a man in his late 30s, strong from years of hard work but quiet, as if the land had taken away his need for constant conversation. He had arrived at the ranch several years before, looking to make a living from the land after losing his family in an accident that still haunted him. The ranch had become his refuge, and he spent his days tending to cattle, fixing fences, and taking care of the few crops he could manage. His nights were usually spent alone, with only the stars above and the sounds of nature to keep him company. On that particular evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting a golden light over the plains, James was out checking his cattle. He had been moving slowly, his horse trotting along the familiar trail, when something caught his attention. A figure, barely visible against the long grasses, seemed to move in the distance. It was odd to see anyone out there, as most people stayed clear of the wilderness, either too busy with their own lives or too afraid of the dangers the land could hold. Curiosity pulled at James, and he urged his horse forward. The figure appeared to be struggling, stumbling and dragging itself across the open land. It was a girl, or at least what seemed to be a girl, her body low to the ground, moving with an unnatural slowness. As he got closer, he saw that she was covered in dirt, her clothes torn, and a dark stain of blood soaking into the fabric of her dress. Fear flashed through James. This was a time when settlers and the native tribes were constantly at odds, and there were always stories of raids and violence. But something in the girl's movement, her desperate struggle to crawl, stopped him. The instinct to help, to do what was right, overpowered the fear. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. His eyes scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. The plains were wide open, and there was no sign of anyone else around. The girl's condition seemed to be worsening by the second, and James knew he didn't have time to waste. He knelt down beside her, careful not to startle her. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wasn't speaking. Instead, she seemed to be trying to communicate with her eyes alone, as if asking him for help without using words. James hesitated. He had heard stories of native raids in the area, of people being attacked and losing everything. But looking at this girl, there was no sign of malice in her. She was just a child, caught in something much bigger than herself. "I'm not going to hurt you," James said softly, trying to reassure her, though his voice didn't seem to carry much confidence. He knew that if she didn't trust him, he wouldn't be able to help her. The girl's eyes softened slightly at the sound of his voice. She nodded, weakly, but didn't speak. James quickly untied the rope from his saddle and used it to gently lift her into his arms, making sure not to jostle her too much. She winced in pain but didn't protest. Her weight was light, but her body seemed fragile, as if the injuries had taken a heavy toll on her. His horse, a steady and patient animal, stood quietly nearby, as if sensing the urgency of the situation. James carefully hoisted the girl up onto the horse, making sure she was securely settled before mounting behind her. He adjusted his position to support her, keeping her upright as best he could, all while keeping an eye on the horizon, still wary of any sudden movements in the distance. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than it should have. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the hills, leaving the land bathed in the purple glow of twilight. James could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. What if this girl was part of a larger group? What if helping her meant bringing trouble to his doorstep? The questions filled his mind, But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't just leave her out here to die alone. When they finally reached the ranch, James carefully helped her off the horse, leading her inside the small, simple cabin that had become his home. The cabin was modest, with wooden floors and a fireplace in the corner. The walls were lined with the tools and supplies he used to run the ranch. It wasn't much, but it had been enough for him. James set the girl down on a small cot by the fire, his hands shaking as he tried to steady her. She was barely conscious now, and he could see how badly the wound on her leg had torn into her flesh. The blood had dried in thick patches, and the injury looked deep. It was a miracle she had made it this far without collapsing. He moved quickly to gather supplies. He had learned a little about basic first aid over the years, but he wasn't sure how much good it would do in a situation like this. His heart raced as he cleaned the wound and tried to stop the bleeding, his hands working with urgency. The girl remained still, her eyes closed, but he could feel her breathing shallowly beneath his touch. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling sound of the fire. James didn't know what the morning would bring. He didn't know who she was, or where she had come from. But he did know one thing: he couldn't turn her away. She had trusted him enough to come to him for help, and now it was his turn to protect her. As he finished wrapping her leg in bandages, James leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He watched her for a moment, her small frame lying motionless on the cot. He didn't know what kind of trouble he might have just invited into his life. But for the moment, there was nothing he could do except wait and hope. The world outside seemed distant, as if time had slowed down just for him. The vast land stretched endlessly in all directions, but tonight it felt different. The wind carried a sense of mystery, as if the very air around him was filled with the unknown. James settled into a quiet silence, the weight of the girl's presence heavy on his mind. He had helped her. But what would happen when the morning came? What would the world outside his ranch look like when the sun rose? He didn't know. But he was about to find out. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, both for James and for the girl. He had done what he could to help her, but every time he looked at her, he felt the weight of what he had done and the weight of what might come next. The land around his ranch was peaceful, yes, but there was always an undercurrent of tension between the settlers and the native tribes. A tension that James had always tried to avoid. Now, with the girl in his care, he feared that this peace could shatter at any moment. The girl, whose name he had learned was Ayanna, had been unconscious for the first few days after James had brought her back to his ranch. She had suffered a deep wound from an arrow, and her body had been weak from blood loss and exhaustion. But, as the days passed, the signs of recovery began to show. Her breathing became steadier, and her fever finally broke. James spent the hours caring for her in silence. He would bring her water and food, but she remained quiet, her eyes half closed as she lay in the bed near the fire. Occasionally, she would stir and mumble something in a language James didn't understand, but her words were soft and unintelligible. He would sit next to her, watching her carefully, making sure she had what she needed, even if she didn't ask for it. He had learned a little about the native tribes over the years, enough to know that their people were strong, but also proud. He had heard stories from other settlers about the dangers of crossing paths with the tribes. But he had also heard stories of kindness, of trades, and of respect between settlers and native people when both sides took the time to understand one another. He didn't know which path Ayanna's people would choose if they found out she had been helped by a settler, but he couldn't imagine them simply turning away from her. One evening, after a few days had passed, Ayanna finally opened her eyes fully. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the fire and the dim light of the room. When her eyes met James's, she blinked slowly, as if unsure whether to trust him or not. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse but clear. James was startled to hear her speak. He had expected her to wake up with more confusion, or perhaps more fear. Instead, she seemed calm, almost as if she had been waiting for this moment. "You're safe," James replied simply, his voice soft. "You're at my ranch. You've been hurt, but I'm taking care of you." Ayanna didn't respond immediately. She turned her head slightly, gazing at the small room and the simple furnishings around her. Then, she slowly shifted her body, wincing as she adjusted her position. James could see that she was in pain, but there was a fire in her eyes, a strength that made him think she was much more than just a victim of her injuries. "Why did you help me?" Ayanna asked after a long pause. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight of curiosity and caution. It was a question James had been expecting, though he didn't quite know how to answer it. James leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. He studied her face, looking for any signs of anger, fear, or distrust. To his surprise, there was none. She simply looked at him with a quiet, intense gaze. "I couldn't leave you out there," James said honestly, his voice steady. "You were hurt. I had to help." Ayanna's eyes softened slightly, though there was still a wariness about her. She glanced down at her wound, as if reminding herself of the danger she had been in. "I didn't ask for your help," she murmured, almost to herself. "I didn't ask for anything." James nodded slowly. He understood that. She hadn't asked for anything. But sometimes people did things out of kindness, not expecting anything in return. "Sometimes, it's not about asking," James said quietly. "Sometimes, it's just about doing what's right." Ayanna didn't say anything for a long time. She simply stared at the fire, lost in thought. James let her be, knowing that she would speak when she was ready. The next few days passed in a quiet routine. James continued to care for Ayanna, providing her with food, water, and rest. He even went out to the nearby stream to gather fresh herbs, making teas and poultices to help with her healing. Ayanna, though still cautious, seemed to be slowly regaining her strength. Her leg was no longer as swollen, and the fever had completely subsided. But there was a distance between them, an unspoken barrier that neither of them dared to cross. Ayanna rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were few and guarded. James didn't push her to talk. He understood that trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned. One evening, as James sat at the small wooden table, eating a simple meal of beans and corn, Ayanna finally spoke again. "I know you're afraid of me," she said, her voice soft but firm. James looked up from his meal, surprised by the suddenness of her statement. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, trying to sound reassuring. Ayanna met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something different in her eyes, a mixture of pain, uncertainty, and something else. Something deeper. "I'm not afraid of you either," she replied, though her words sounded more like a statement than a promise. "But you should be afraid of what happens when my people find out I'm here." James felt a chill run down his spine at her words. He knew what she meant. Her people, the Lakota, were a strong and proud tribe, and they didn't take kindly to settlers interfering with their lives. "I know," James said quietly, his voice tinged with worry. "I don't know what will happen, but I couldn't just leave you." Ayanna didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the fire again, lost in thought. For a long while, the two of them sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of animals in the night. James knew that the tension between them wasn't just about her injuries. It was about something much larger, something he couldn't control. Her people would come. He was certain of that. And when they did, he would have to face whatever consequences came with helping her. The next day, Ayanna was stronger, though she still limped when she walked. She moved around the cabin slowly, as if she were testing the boundaries of her recovery. James watched her, unsure of what to do or say. She was beginning to trust him, but he knew that her loyalty was first to her people, not to him. He had made a choice to help her, But what came next was out of his hands. And as the days passed, James couldn't shake the feeling that his decision would change his life forever. The days that followed felt as though they were stuck in time. Each morning, the sun rose lazily over the plains, and James went about his usual routine, checking on the cattle, tending to the fences, and making sure the land was in good condition. But no matter how much he worked, the feeling of unease never left him. It weighed heavily on his chest, a constant reminder that Ayanna's presence on his ranch was not something he could simply ignore. Ayanna had regained enough strength to move around the cabin with ease, though she still walked with a slight limp. She spent most of her time sitting by the fire, her eyes often staring into the flames as if searching for answers. James tried to respect her need for quiet, but it was clear she was still struggling with something much deeper than just her injury. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were short and guarded. James could sense that she was grateful for his help, but she was also torn between the kindness he had shown her and the loyalty she owed to her people. The silence between them grew thicker with each passing day, and yet, James found himself strangely comforted by it. He had always been a solitary person, and having Ayanna in the cabin was a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone. Still, there was something about her quiet presence that unsettled him. The unease was not just about her past or her people, it was the sense that something was coming, something neither of them could control. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a soft shade of purple, Ayanna finally spoke again. This time, her voice was soft but firm, as if she had made a decision. "Tomorrow, they will come," she said, her words hanging in the air. "I can feel it." James stopped what he was doing, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't need to ask who she was talking about. The Lakota. Her people. The tribe she had left behind. The tribe that had taught her to be strong, to survive. Ayanna had always been quiet about her life before coming to the ranch. James had tried to ask her about it once, but she had shut down, refusing to share any details. He knew she had come from a family of warriors, but beyond that, he had no idea what her life had been like. What he did know was that the Lakota didn't take kindly to settlers, and if they found out she was here, things could get dangerous fast. "You think they'll come tomorrow?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "My people move silently. They will come in the night, when the moon is high. They won't speak to you unless they must. They will not ask questions. They will simply take me back." James swallowed hard, trying to push down the growing knot in his stomach. He had known that this day would come. He had tried to prepare himself for it, but hearing Ayanna say the words out loud made it all feel so real. "They won't hurt you, will they?" James asked, though deep down, he feared the answer. Ayanna's eyes met his for the first time in what felt like days. "They won't hurt me," she said, her voice calm, but filled with an unspoken sadness. "But they will not leave you in peace. They will not forgive what you have done." James understood the weight of her words. She was part of a proud tribe, a tribe that didn't forget easily. Her people would never forgive the fact that he had helped her. They would see it as an act of betrayal, and they would come to reclaim her. He could feel the tension building in his chest, his mind racing with questions and fears. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Ayanna didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "There is nothing you can do," she said softly. "This is the way it is. You helped me, and for that, you will face the consequences. But know this, you did what was right. And sometimes, doing what is right means accepting the consequences." James felt his heart heavy with her words. He had hoped for some way out of this, some way to make things right with her people. But it was clear now that there was no easy answer. The Lakota would come, and they would take her back. no matter what James did or said. That night, James lay awake in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The wind outside howled, sending a chill through the cabin. He could hear the distant sounds of coyotes and other animals. But beneath it all, there was a stillness, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that the end was near. That everything he had worked for, everything he had built, might be taken from him in the blink of an eye. The idea of losing his ranch, of losing the peace he had worked so hard to create, was unbearable. But it wasn't just that. He had come to care for Ayanna. In his own quiet way, she was strong, determined, and beautiful, even in her silence. What would happen to her when she went back to her people? Would they accept her? Would they punish her for what had happened? He didn't know, but he feared the worst. The next day passed slowly, each hour dragging on with an unbearable weight. James spent the day preparing, though he wasn't sure for what. He made sure the ranch was secure, double-checking the locks on the doors and the windows. He looked over the land, his eyes scanning the horizon, but there was no sign of anyone. No sign of the Lakota, no sign of danger. Yet, he knew they were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the world was painted in shades of orange and purple, Ayanna came to him. She didn't speak, but her presence alone told him everything he needed to know. She had already accepted the truth of what was coming. James wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension between them. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging what was about to happen. They sat together in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up, swirling the dust around in the fading light. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute like an eternity. As the hours passed, James couldn't help but feel that the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The Lakota would come soon, and when they did, James knew there would be no turning back. The night passed quietly, too quietly for James's liking. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of animals and insects were strangely absent. It felt as if the whole world had fallen into a deep, uneasy silence. James sat in his chair by the fire, his eyes constantly flickering toward the door, his mind racing with thoughts of what was about to unfold. Ayanna had gone to bed early that night, but James knew she wasn't sleeping. He could hear the occasional shifting of blankets, the quiet sighs that drifted through the room as she fought with her own thoughts. He couldn't blame her. She had been through so much, and now she faced an uncertain future. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but he knew it would change everything. As the hours wore on, James tried to focus on the tasks at hand, checking the cattle again, making sure the gates were secure, making sure his rifle was ready just in case. He knew he had to be prepared, but he didn't want to believe it would come to that. His mind kept drifting back to Ayanna. She was the key to everything. If the Lakota came for her, there was nothing he could do to stop it. All he could do now was wait and hope for the best. The sky began to lighten just before dawn. A faint glow on the horizon signaled the coming of another day. But James didn't feel the relief he usually did at sunrise. The first rays of sunlight only seemed to amplify the tension that had been building inside him. It was then that he heard them. At first, it was just a whisper, a faint rustling sound, like the breeze moving through the grass. But soon, the whispers grew louder, and James felt his heart race. There were people out there, and they were moving closer. His first instinct was to go outside, to see if he could spot them. But then he remembered Ayanna. He needed to make sure she was safe, that she was prepared. He hurried to her room, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He knocked gently on the door before entering. Ayanna was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and alert, even though she hadn't spoken a word. She was ready. She had known this moment would come, and now she was ready to face it. "They're here," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't need to say more. Ayana's calm expression told him she already knew. They are, she replied, her voice steady, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. They are close now. James. James didn't know what to say to that. His mind was racing. He wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, that he would protect her no matter what. But those words felt hollow. He knew he couldn't protect her from what was coming. He had no way of stopping the tribe if they decided to take her back. The only thing he could do now was stand with her and face whatever happened next. Do you want to leave? James asked, his voice quiet. Ayana shook her head slowly, her gaze steady. I cannot leave. My people will find me wherever I go. It is my fate to return to them. I cannot run from that. James felt a lump in his throat. He had never imagined his life would come to this, a rancher caught between two worlds, trying to do the right thing, but knowing that doing so would come with consequences. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he tried to push it aside. He had made his choice when he helped Ayana, and he wasn't going to back down now. The sound of footsteps outside, soft but steady, reminded him that the Lakota were drawing nearer. It was time. James and Ayana stood together at the door, listening to the growing sounds of movement outside. James wasn't sure how many there were, but the sense of power and authority in their footsteps told him that this was not just a small group. The Lakota had come in force, and they were not here for a friendly conversation. Ayana took a deep breath, as though preparing herself for something she had always known would happen. She turned to James one last time, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. I wish things could have been different, she said quietly. I wish I could have stayed here with you. James wanted to say something in response, but the words caught in his throat. There was no point in pretending that things could be different. The reality of the situation was clear, and no amount of wishing could change it. I'm sorry, James said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted this for you. You've been through enough. Ayana gave him a small, sad smile. You helped me when no one else would. I will always remember that. James opened the door, stepping outside into the cool morning air. The sky was just beginning to brighten, and the land stretched out before him in a peaceful silence. But that peace was about to be broken. He didn't see them at first, no warriors standing in the open, no banners waving in the wind. But he felt their presence. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, and his heart quickened as he looked around. The Lakota were there, just out of sight, hidden in the landscape, moving with the quiet precision of hunters. He knew that they were surrounding the ranch, that they were waiting for something. It was then that he saw them, two figures, moving through the tall grass with the grace of shadows. They were dressed in traditional clothing, their faces painted, their movements deliberate. Ayana stepped beside him, her eyes searching the land, her posture poised and strong. She had never looked more at home than she did now, standing at the threshold of her future, ready to return to her people. James didn't know what to do next. His heart was racing, and his mind was full of questions. Would they attack? Would they take her from him without a word? Or would they simply ask her to return, without violence? He had no way of knowing what their response would be, but he knew he had to stay calm. One of the figures emerged from the grass, walking slowly toward James and Ayana. His face was stern, his eyes cold, but there was a deep respect in his gaze. He was the leader of the Lakota, and his presence commanded attention. James Mercer, the man said, his voice deep and steady. You have aided one of our own. For that, we thank you. James didn't know how to respond. He was speechless, unsure of whether to feel relief or fear. But know this, the leader continued. Your actions have not gone unnoticed. You have done what was right, and for that, we respect you. But Ayana must return to us. She belongs with her people. James nodded slowly, his chest tight with emotion. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all feel too real. I understand, James said quietly. I did what I could to help her, but I know she has to go back. Ayanna didn't look back at him as she stepped forward. She was ready. She had made peace with her fate. And now, the time had come for her to return to the people she belonged to. The Lakota leader nodded once, his expression softening slightly. You have done well. You may go in peace. With that, the Lakota turned, their figures disappearing back into the tall grass, leaving James and Ayanna standing alone, facing the morning sun. The morning light seemed different somehow. Softer, almost as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The Lakota had come and gone without a word of violence, leaving behind only the silence of the open plains. James stood on the edge of his ranch, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Ayanna was gone now. The girl who had come to him wounded and alone, the girl whose fate he had tried to alter, had returned to her people. She had walked away from his life as silently as she had entered it, leaving James to stand in the emptiness of the morning. For a long moment, James didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the land, as if waiting for something to change, some sign that he had made the right decision. But there was nothing. The wind continued to blow softly through the grass, the cattle wandered slowly in the distance, and the world carried on as if nothing had happened. He had helped Ayanna. He had done what he thought was right, and yet, he couldn't help feeling a deep sense of loss, an emptiness that seemed to grow with every passing second. He had known, from the very beginning, that there would be consequences. He had known that the Lakota would come for her, that he couldn't hold on to her forever. But knowing something in your mind and feeling it in your heart were two very different things. Turning away from the horizon, James made his way back to the cabin. The door creaked softly as he opened it, stepping inside to the quiet, empty space. The room where Ayanna had once rested felt cold now, despite the warmth of the fire still flickering in the hearth. There was no more soft breathing from the cot by the fire, no more quiet murmurs of thanks or awkward silences between them. The space was just as it had been before she arrived, silent, lonely, and now, empty. James sat down by the fire, his gaze falling on the spot where Ayanna had slept. He ran his hand through his hair, frustration and sorrow mixing in his chest. It wasn't just that she was gone, it was that he had known, deep down, that this would happen, that one day, her people would come, and she would have to leave. But even in that knowledge, he had tried to change things. He had tried to make her stay, tried to protect her from the harsh reality of her life. But he hadn't been able to. There had been no way to fight against the truth of her existence, the pull of her tribe and her place among them. The Lakota didn't need to ask for her back, they had a right to her, a claim that James could not stand in the way of. He had known that, and yet, he had still hoped. The days that followed were filled with a quiet emptiness that James couldn't shake. The ranch seemed quieter now, almost abandoned. The wind still swept across the land, and the cattle still grazed on the open fields. But nothing felt the same. Ayanna had brought life into the cabin, a sense of purpose that had made the days pass more quickly. Without her, everything felt slower, more distant. Even the animals seemed less lively, less vibrant, as if they, too, could feel her absence. But life went on, as it always did. James went about his chores with the same quiet diligence he always had, though his mind wasn't fully present. He couldn't help but think of Ayanna, of her quiet strength, her quiet sadness. He wondered if she was safe now, if she was truly at peace with her people. He hoped she was, but the uncertainty lingered, gnawing at him. One evening, as James sat outside on the porch, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the dark sky, a figure appeared on the horizon. For a moment, He thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, that he was imagining things. But as the figure drew closer, he realized it was real. Ayanna. She was walking slowly toward the ranch, her movements cautious, almost hesitant. James stood up quickly, his heart racing. What was she doing here? Had something gone wrong? Had the Lakota rejected her? Or had something else happened that he didn't understand? Ayanna didn't speak at first. She just stood there, a few steps away from him. Her eyes locked on his. The same quiet strength was in her gaze. But now, there was something else there too. Something deeper. Something that James couldn't quite place. I thought you had gone back to your people, James said, his voice shaking slightly. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he hadn't expected this. I did, Ayanna replied, her voice steady but carrying a sadness James could feel. I went back, but my place is not with them anymore. I had to come back. James felt his breath catch in his throat. Why? Why would you come back here? After everything? After what happened? Ayanna took a deep breath, her eyes softening. I've learned that my people are strong. Yes, but they live by rules that I can no longer follow. I have changed, James, and I can't go back to the life I once had. James stood still, unsure of how to respond. He didn't know what to say, what to think. Ayanna had chosen to return to him, but he had no idea what that meant. Was she staying? Would she try to make a life with him? Could he even protect her if she decided to stay? You're welcome here, James said finally, his voice low. You can stay as long as you need. But I don't know what happens next. I don't know what your people will think. I don't know what they'll do. Ayanna nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. I know, but I don't belong there anymore. And maybe I don't belong here either. But for now, I want to be here. I want to be with you. James looked at her for a long moment, his heart still heavy but also strangely lighter. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that the future was uncertain. But there was something in Ayanna's words, something in the way she looked at him, that gave him hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to build something new together, something different from what either of them had known before. For the first time in days, James allowed himself to believe that there was still a chance for peace, for a future. Ayanna had made her choice, and now it was time for him to make his own. He didn't know what would happen next, but for now, it was enough to know that they were no longer alone. Together, they could face whatever the future held.